Welcome to another episode of the Storm Shadow Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by longtime follower and listener, Paul Shaviv. For any of you involved in schools, principals, administrators, presidents, board members, and so on, Paul Shaviv's now classic book on Jewish school management is indispensable. Based on decades of experience in several major communities and in schools across the Jewish spectrum, it has all you need to know. The Jewish High School, a complete management guide, is available on Amazon, and you can find the link to purchase in the show notes. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast in any way, you can email me, svarmchat@gmail.com, or you can find the link and information in the show notes. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, news farm, book deals, and so on, as well as a link to the Svarm Chatter status, which is the same if you prefer it that way. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Shmuel Feiner, who is the Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History at Bar Ilan University, Chairman of the Historical Society of Israel, and member of the Israel Academy of Science and Humanities. And he is now the publisher/editor of the new edition of Divrei Sholom V'Emes, which is, the subtitle in Ivrit is Ma'apechat HaChinuch HaYehudi HaModerni, which is Naftali Hertz's Weisel or Weasel or Wesley, Hartwig Wesley's work, famous work. These are all four parts are included in here. Sometimes when people discuss this work, they only think of Divrei Sholom V'Emes and not the other parts, which is Divrei Sholom V'Emes was the first one published in 1782, and then you had the follow-ups, Rav Tov L'Beis Yisrael, Ein Mishpat, and Rechoves Rechovot. So you had four parts, and there's two small appendices in here, as well as there is a lengthy introduction by Professor Feiner. So we'll discuss Wesley and this work, which had created so much controversy in its time. So thank you, Professor Feiner, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me, Nachi.
When did you first encounter the text, Divrei Sholom V'Emes?
Well, I believe that Divrei Sholom V'Emet was already considered important when it was first published in the 1780s. 240 years ago, people who encountered this text realized immediately that there is something very important and meaningful. And since then, all Jewish historians wrote about him. We read in the introductory classes at the Hebrew University when I studied few decades ago, mainly the first page of the book, where Wesley made this crucial distinction that today seems very simple and self-understood, but at the time was revolutionary, the distinction between two main realms of knowledge, the Jewish and the general, what he called Torat Adam and Torat Elohim. And I actually was startled from the first time by the importance of 5 or 6 simple words in Hebrew at the first page. And let me just cite it in Hebrew and then in English translation. והנה לחנך בני ישראל על הסדר הנכון, יחלק לשתי מחלקות. הסדר הנכון, well, those words seem so innocent, but let me now read it in the English translation. Now, said Wesley, in order to educate the youth of Israel in the proper manner, 2 types of studies should be established. And then he made this famous distinction between study of human knowledge, Torat Adam, and all the other, and the Jewish knowledge, which was called Torat Hashem, or Torat Elohim. In the proper manner, meaning what we are doing at the time, what we are doing in the Cheder, in the Yeshiva, is totally wrong. Because I, Wesley, know better what should be done. And this was no less a revolutionary announcement than, I would say, the French Revolution that would come 7 years later, when the revolutionaries announced that they can criticize and they can suggest a different system, a different way of life for everybody. So that's why I think for the first time that I encountered this text, I realized that it's very important. And for many, many years, I wanted to publish it in a new edition, including all 4 parts, because again, usually we only read the first page.
Yeah, and that's a couple of things there to follow up on. Very important. First of all, it's very important that it's back in print. It's very important text, and it's also important that you publish all 4 parts. There's so many people, even scholars that I've talked to about this text, and they're like, well, they just know of the first part. Well, he published more, so you should read the whole thing, and you should know what he had to say throughout the controversy over the work. There's definitely that, and there's definitely more to, as we'll get into, the controversy that erupted over the text, especially from the first part. And some things, as you mentioned, the 2 parts that he says, the Teres Hashem, Teres Halakim, Teres Ha'adam, the 2 different parts, and we can go further in there. And also some comments that he said, notably, Kol Talmud Chacham she'ein bo derech eretz nevela srucha toiva himenu. He quotes that medrash that a rotten carcass is better than a Talmud Chacham that doesn't have derech eretz, and the Nedi Behuta David Tevli of Lisa went ballistic over that, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I do want to, I think it's important to mention, at least in brief sketch of Wesley, or Vesely, if you will, for the listener. Who is this person that they're hearing? He lives 1725 in Hamburg to 1805. Yes. Who is he? He's in Hamburg, he's in Amsterdam, he's in Berlin. Who is he? First of all, if you haven't, the pictures included in the book, we should also Google. He looks great. Looks like someone once put, it looks like he belongs on a dollar bill with a wig and everything. But he's the Talmud of Rebbeinu Eibeshitz. Give the basic biography of him, if you will, for the listeners, so they can understand who we're talking about, when he lived, and what's going on.
So the life of Naftalius Vesely actually covered most of the 18th century. He was born exactly 300 years ago in 1725 in Hamburg, to an Ashkenazi family. The origins were in Poland, like many other Jewish families who immigrated to the West. It was a family of merchants. They moved from Hamburg to Copenhagen, a young and special community. And by the way, the real founding father of the Haskalah movement, Isaac Euchel, that was born a generation after Vesely, was also from Copenhagen originally. So from Copenhagen, they moved to Amsterdam, and there the young Vesely found a circle of early Maskilim. We may say something more about this important phenomena later. And he actually, in Amsterdam, found some fellows that shared his interest in the Hebrew language, in poetry, in literature, and he didn't get, that's important to emphasize, any formal education. Like his future friend Moses Mendelssohn, he didn't attend school, gymnasium, or university, but he has a talent as a poet. He actually made some money by composing poems for certain occasions, for certain communities, like a poem in honor of the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, or for the Prussian King Frederick the Great, and many, many others. And he maybe today his name is not so well known, even for those who think or read about the Haskalah. The prominent name of Moses Mendelssohn is always on the headlines, but Vesely is less mentioned. But at the time, and even in the 19th century and the 20th century, he was a very well known as one of the pioneers in the history of modern Hebrew poetry. And that's mainly because of his unusual, actually, epos, Shirei Tiferet. It's a biblical poem. Moses is at the center. It was published in few parts, and in the 19th century, among the Maskilim in the Russian Empire, and later even in the land of Israel, parts of this poetry became common knowledge, something that children should read, and it was included in Hebrew readers. So he was well known. There is even a street in Tel Aviv named after him. And something that's also very important, meaningful, and telling a lot about Vesely is that when he got older, he moved again to Hamburg to join some of his family, and there he made an official request to be buried in the Spanish section of the Jewish cemetery of Altona. Altona at the time was a separate town under a Danish rule, and the people from Hamburg and the Jews from Hamburg, from Wandsbek, and from Altona was buried there. It's a very interesting cemetery, by the way, and people coming there mainly to put zetlech on the grave of the famous rabbis Jonathan Eibishitz and Yaakov Emden, who are buried not far away from each other, although they didn't like each other and had a lot under dispute between them. So Vesely got this permission, and you can find his grave today in the Spanish section of this interesting cemetery. And we should ask why. He was completely Ashkenazi, but I believe that he identified with the Spanish community that, according to his view, represented his views concerning education, concerning the Hebrew language, but maybe also because of this sense of frustration and insult that he felt because of the persecutions that he suffered because of his Divrei Sholom Ve'emet, which we're going to discuss in details in the moment.
Okay, so as you mentioned, he's in the Spanish-Portuguese community there, in the cemetery there in Hamburg, which had a large Spanish-Portuguese community. He is a Talmud of Yonasan Eibishitz. That's his Rebbe. So you mentioned that as well. And it's important to mention, a couple of things, but also he wrote a number of Sfarim, including Yein Levanon on Pirkei Avos. He wrote Chachma Shleima. He found this work he translated from Greek, and he said it's attributed to Shlomo Melech, and he wrote a commentary on it, Ruach Chaim. He also has a work, Gan Nol, which he published in two different parts, on Shirashim, on words, which is a thing that he was very involved with. He also, we'll see, he was, as you mentioned, he was friends with Mendelssohn, so he was actually the Be'er of Mendelssohn on Vayikra, was written by Vesely, and some other things. But it's important to mention right here at the outset that originally on his Gan Nol, on actually Yein Levanon, he has a haskama from Rav David Tevli Lisa, one of those that will attack him, and from Noda B'Yehuda, Cheskel Landau. And Noda B'Yehuda, I don't have it in front of me, but he says essentially that I loved reading your Svarim. I greatly enjoyed them. I really enjoyed reading them. That's why I gave you this. It's called, I think, a Michtav Bracha. I gave you this because I really enjoyed them. Obviously, later on, he'll recant that and he will attack him, but he obviously enjoyed reading his works. And so also another thing worth mentioning is that you mentioned Hamburg. At the end of his life, in Hamburg, there's an author, I think this is well known as well, you discussed this, is that Pnei Tevel work of Moses Mendelssohn of Hamburg, who's not Moses Mendelssohn. This is uncle of Rav Shamshul for Hirsch. And he says, and one of the things he says, he talks about his relationship with Wesley, and he says that all of the, he talks a lot about him, and he says all the manuscripts, Wesley's manuscripts, are in the possession of his nephew, Rav Shmuel Hirsch. And we know this if you read Hirsch, you read the Hirsch and Vayikra today, you'll see he quotes him a number of times, and there are plenty of other times he doesn't. In fact, the first piece on Pirkei Avos in Rav Hirsch's first piece is quoting Wesley's first piece, and he quotes it actually, I think in the Hebrew edition they removed the citation, the English one it's in there. So he's quoted extensively later on. We can get, I'll just mention this here already for those listening that know a little bit of the controversy. When we'll get to the controversy, and there's a whole back and forth, but his son later on, well after the controversy, after he dies in the mid-1800s, publishes a part of his work on Bereshis, which now has, and most of his Svarim and Bereshis has been republished, called Imre Shefer by Rav Moshe Tzuriel, who just passed away a few years ago, redid most of the Svarim. So, but the part of it that was printed, I think it was Elis Naftali they called it, when they printed it, he got a glowing haskama from the Aruch LaNer, Yaakov Ettlinger. So it's a glowing, so this is well after the controversy, and well after everything, and he gives a glowing, he gives haskama to Harav, to Rav Naftali Hertz Faisal, and he gives him a whole haskama. So it's worth pointing that out as well. Obviously, there's another part of the controversy. Okay, so he's in Berlin at some point. Go ahead, what do you want to say?
Just a short comment, Nachi. What you are telling us is that history is complicated, of course, and nothing is black and white. And even more important, that collective memory is very tricky and dynamic and changing all the time. So that's, I think, what happened to Wesley. But as an historian, I really want to put him in the context of his place and time.
Absolutely. I just wanted to point a few things out for the listeners. Okay, so I think you touched on the relationship with Mendelssohn just a little more before we get to Divrei Sholom because it's so important. His relationship with Mendelssohn, his involvement in the Be'er project. He writes Mahalal Reya, a little intro. He does Vayikra. What's his involvement there with Mendelssohn and with Mendelssohn's massive project?
Yeah, first of all, I didn't mention it before, but the next stop in his life after Amsterdam was Berlin. He lived there for many years. He was next door neighbor of Moses Mendelssohn, so they became friends. In a certain way, they also became a colleague. And I think that we all know about this project of Biur. And I think it's also important to put this project into context and to understand why was it important historically. I believe that behind everything was a new treatment of the Bible, and the motivation came out of the Protestants' new evaluation of the Bible and the availability of Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into German. And Moses Mendelssohn was very much aware of it. He was a Bible scholar in a certain way, and he believed that that this is the Bible is an extraordinary cultural asset of the Jews, and therefore they cannot read it through a German translation of a Christian. They need their own Jewish translation into German. And what Mendelssohn did was again something very, very special. It became actually a collective literary project, one of the first in modern Jewish culture, and in the modern Jewish book. Mendelssohn translated the Torah into German. It was printed in Hebrew letters, meaning that the audience was exclusively Jewish. It wasn't for non-Jews who could consult other translations if they wanted. This was in the generation when the German language became more and more the spoken language of more and more Jews in Central Europe. But Mendelssohn gathered few colleagues and friends in order to write the commentary on the 5 books of the Torah, and he divided it between actually 5 people, and Vesely got Sefer Vayikra. He got the Leviticus to write a commentary on it. I'm not sure if they actually met together in the same place, and they decided what they are going to do, and they shared the experience of writing commentary at the time. They could, of course, use the Zoom, but it was too early for them. So they couldn't do it. But each of them actually produced his own commentary on the Torah, and the result was again a collective project by few people who basically shared the same ideas about the need for German translation, the need for a new commentary, and the need to make the Bible, let's say, great again for the Jews. We all know that in the traditional in educational institutions of the Jews, the Cheder and the Yeshiva, the main aim was the Talmud, not the Bible itself. But those who participated in this project believed that children should learn the Torah, the all 5 books, maybe even more books of the Bible. You know, there was a continuation of the Biur, and also for Nevi'im and Ketuvim, and Menachem also contributed to this. And that was one of the main projects of, let's say, Jewish traditional enlightenment. Although they did not deviate from tradition, and in the commentary, that's why you mentioned that Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Nechama Leibovitz, they could use this commentary because there was nothing there that was critical. Actually, Mendelssohn rejected the new trends of the 17th and 18th century of criticism of the Bible, of questioning the origins of the Torah and other things. And from that point of view, he was conservative, and today we would call him and Vesely Orthodox.
Let's turn briefly to something that you discussed at length in your book, The Jewish Enlightenment, which is the early Haskalah. I think this is important now, as we explained, as you said earlier, to put Vesely and the whole Divrei Sholom Emes in its cultural context and what was happening at the time. So what's this early Haskalah, if you will, and what's Wesley's involvement in that?
Yeah, okay. So first, let me say that Haskalah is the Jewish case of the European Enlightenment. That central and revolutionary trend in the culture and the thought of Europe in the 18th century, mainly in France, in Britain, in Germany. But the Haskalah as an organized movement was only organized in the 1780s, exactly around the date of the publication of Divrei Sholom Ve'emet, but very late concerning the Enlightenment in Europe. But from the very beginning of the 18th century, we can already identify early Maskilim, individuals, but also few small circles of Maskilim, like the one that Vesely belonged to in Amsterdam. And this is a fascinating phenomena, and it can be described by intellectual history and also by history of emotions. Because when we speak about early Maskilim, we look at few talented young fellows who were educated in the Cheder, Bet HaMidrash, some of them in yeshivot, but they were complaining that the knowledge which is accessible to them is only Talmudic knowledge, rabbinical knowledge. And they ask, what about the non-religious? What about the non-Jewish knowledge? Why is it neglected? They even felt inferior that they, the Jews, cannot have any access to what is called external knowledge, while this is the time when scholarship, science, philosophy, everything is flourishing among the non-Jewish elite, intellectuals, academics. Some of them actually studies in German universities or in Italian university, mainly in order to study medicine. They were excited to be exposed to knowledge which in their own Jewish society was considered forbidden. And because it was forbidden, they actually testified some erotic attraction even to this knowledge. And some of them decided that they should change the situation. They should do something about it. They should, for example, republish texts in science and philosophy the Jews wrote in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. No wonder that the Rambam became an important model figure for them. Just remember that Moreh Nevuchim was published in 1742, after about 200 years that he wasn't present in the Jewish on the Jewish bookshelf in a Jewish library in a certain way. So some of them decided to publish textbooks. And I'll just give you two examples that I really like and I think is very, very important of writings by early Maskilim. The first is Ansel Worms. No one actually knows about him. He didn't left an heritage. It's important and meaningful in order us to learn. Ansel Worms was a medical student from Frankfurt University at the beginning of the 18th century. And he wrote a very modest textbook on algebra in Hebrew. And in the introduction, he told his readers about an erotic dream that he had. And in the dream, he saw himself saving a beautiful maiden from death. And the maiden, when she opened her eyes, she said something like, "Oh, I'm so grateful. You are my savior. And I never actually tell my name, and I don't say anything about identity, but you, my savior, I'm going to tell you that I am the wisdom of algebra. So you saved me from death, because nobody engaged with me, of course, among the Jews." And the other example, a lot more well-known, let's say, early Maskil, was Tuvia Cohen, also a medical student in early 18th century, who composed the science and the medicine book Maaseh Tuvia, a book that became the main source of knowledge for generations of Jews in the 18th century, 19th century, and I saw modern editions of 20th century about the world, about everything, about cosmology and astronomy, biology, anatomy, and many other things. So this was one of the main achievements of the early Maskilim. And Vesely was one of them. His interest was not in science, medicine, or philosophy, but mainly about the bringing new life to the Hebrew language by writing poems, by translation, by writing commentaries, and by emphasize the importance of learning the Hebrew language with its grammar properly.
Okay, so that's all very important, and you elaborate on this at length in your book, The Jewish Enlightenment, which there's an English edition. I'll link to that in the show notes for those interested. Read it there. And you also talk a lot about the Divrei Sholom Emes there too, which we're going to get to now. So now to finish the context and really the backdrop of Divrei Sholom Emes, if you will, is the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II and his Edict of Tolerance. And there's more that's going on in Europe other than just Joseph II, but I think this is important just to set the stage a little bit before we get to why Wesley writes this open letter, if you will, Divrei Sholom Emes.
Yes, so it's impossible to understand Divrei Sholom Ve'emet, this Hebrew text about the importance of modern Jewish education, without actually putting it in the context of his time and without connecting him to one of the colorful, important and interesting rulers at the time in Europe, and that's Emperor Joseph II from Vienna, the emperor of the Austrian Habsburg Empire at the time. Joseph II actually is important because he is the main case before the French Revolution of implementing the ideas of the Enlightenment and making those ideas active in politics. The empire was a Catholic empire. His mother, Maria Theresa, was a devoted Christian, but he was influenced by the culture of the Enlightenment and mainly by the idea of religious tolerance. If we need to choose one principle of the Enlightenment that is crucial, important, and very relevant to our own times, I believe that this is the idea of religious tolerance. Something that Moses Mendelssohn actually also adopted and tried to promote this idea in order to convince the non-Jews to behave differently towards the Jews and make them the citizens and granting them equal rights. And he also used it in order to convince the rabbinical elite in the Jewish community to be tolerant towards their own brothers who have different opinions. Again, very relevant for our own time. So when Joseph II became an emperor in 1780, he started with a policy of reforms in the empire, and one of the main reforms was about the status of the Jews in his empire. Actually, in his empire, he distinguished between few regions: the Jews of Vienna, the Jews of Bohemia, the Jews of Moravia, and the Jews of North Italy and Polish Galicia that was annexed to Austria just a decade earlier. The idea was in the spirit of what we call enlightened absolutism. That means nothing is changed in the character of the state. There are no thoughts about democracy or equal rights, but the states understood that they can actually accept all those who live in its borders as subjects, not citizens yet. That will come again in the French Revolution, out of political and economic understanding that all subjects can contribute to the welfare of the state. So the Jews also can be accepted as subjects, and the religion shouldn't be an obstacle. That's the point where the principles of religious tolerance is coming. But And this is the main innovation concerning the Jews. The rights the Jews are going to have are coming with a condition. There is a price. So if the Jews want to be subjects like everybody else, if they want few prohibitions from the past to abolish, they should transform their life. They should change, because as they are today, as an autonomous community, as a community based on religious education and nothing else, as a community with only a basic knowledge of the language of the country, they cannot be subjects like everybody else. So Joseph II published few tolerance edicts, few ethics of tolerance to the Jews in those certain areas. And he said, I'm going to accept you as subject, but you should be improved. And the first point is, and the most important point is, you should improve your education. You should change your education. You should change also your language. You should know German. You should change your attitudes toward the state, towards the non-Jewish subject. So in that point, the state, out of, let's say, goodwill or interest, started to intervene deeper and deeper into the life of the Jewish community. In Galicia, for example, one of the requirements of the states from the Jews was conscription to the Austrian army. So it was a revolutionary political step. It wasn't emancipation, but a demand for change under the supervision of the country. So in Berlin, Vesely and other Jews heard about this. For them, it was breaking news. At last, a king, an emperor would like to change our life. And at last, he also speaks about education, something that I and few of my colleagues actually believed for many years that this is very crucial. But now it's coming from above.
This is the backdrop to Wesley deciding, you know what, I'm going to write this Divrei Sholom for MS, which has been billed as a open letter, because it's very, very small, the first work, the Divrei Sholom for MS. It's not, and it takes it from Esther, it's not a sefer, if you will. It's unpaginated, the original. It's a small, slim volume. It's an open letter, if you will. So he sets out and he lays out his educational program. He sets out his ideas for Jewish educational reform from within, if you will, and his arguments for that. And we said before, the Teres Lakim, Teres Adam, the two different angles. And he says a couple of quotes, as we mentioned, that Medrash. And if you want to lay out a little bit what he lays out in his program, and then the controversy that erupts over this volume.
I didn't get what was the question?
No, so I'm saying sorry. Okay. So would you like to explain a little bit more? Is there more to explain what Wesley's program is, what he's arguing for essentially in the first part of Divrei Sholom MS, and then consequentially the controversy that erupts of Nadav Yehuda, of David Tevli, of Lisa, and others that attack him over this?
Yeah, okay. So let me continue the story. Imagine that Wesley sitting in a coffee house in Berlin, reading the newspaper, and realizing that there in Vienna, Joseph II just asked the Jews, not the Prussian Jews, the Jews in the Austrian Empire, to open new kind of schools. And he is saying to himself, well, this is really a fulfillment of my own dream. I wanted the Jews to build their own new kind of schools, because I always believed, as an early Maskil, that this limitation of Jewish education just to Jewish subjects is not enough. It's not enough to build a decent life for graduate of the cheder or even the yeshiva, and it is not enough for Jews if they don't want to stay isolated from the surrounding society. So what he did is something, again, he used his talent as a writer. He returned home. He wrote a very short pamphlet, actually, 8 chapters, but slim pamphlet. He printed it on his own expenses, and then he sent copies. They were not for sale. The Divrei Sholom was not for sale. That's a book that booksellers introduced at the time. It was an open letter. He sent each copy as an open letter to a certain address in Europe. And we know about the addresses because we got reactions from those places. So he wrote to the Vilna Gaon. He wrote to Rabbi Yechezkel Landau in Prague. He wrote to Frankfurt, to London, to probably also Amsterdam, and to Italy. And he told them in this open letter, please support me. He wanted to raise a support. He wanted to mobilize actually a Jewish public opinion that will support his plan. And the plan was very simple. Let's open a modern Jewish school. And Divrei Sholom ve'emet is the blueprint of this school. It's about the curriculum. What are the subjects that should be taught in this modern school? He actually even structured in Divrei Sholom ve'emet the school according to classes. He speaks about exams for graduates from one class to another. He speaks about the importance of having professional teachers, not just a melamed, and about writing textbooks for each subject. So the blueprint was in Divrei Sholom ve'emet, and he wanted to convince leaders, mainly rabbis, in several communities in Europe, to actually accept Joseph II plan as something that the Jews themselves would like to do. So some of the communities were outside the jurisdiction of Joseph II, of course. It wasn't relevant for them. It was up to them if they want to do it in their own community. But for example, for the rabbi of Prague, that was very much relevant because Joseph II actually was also the ruler of Bohemia. So I would like to emphasize not just the content, but also the medium. In 1782, there was no Jewish newspaper. So there was no way to publish an opinion in the newspaper, and that hoping that the readers will be convinced. So he did something in between. He actually became a modern Jewish intellectual, wanted to influence public opinion by his own independent initiative, and by actually sending this pamphlet, bypassing the rabbinical elite. And I believe that this was the core and the trigger for the controversy that actually erupted immediately.
Yeah, immediately. And we have this, you can look in the new editions, especially of the Drashas of the Noda B'Yehuda, who as mentioned earlier, had given him haskama on his other svarim, now attacks him with a sermon, with a drasha. Rav David Tevli of Lisa, we have that's been published, and Wesley refutes it later on in the last work, where it gives a sermon attacking him. I think the third one is the Hafla, who goes against him. It's actually quite interesting, by the way, that Wesley is emphatic throughout the third and the fourth. He keeps saying it's Rabboni Poland, it's Polish rabbis. But
Yes.
if I have flaws in Germany, and he even some of the Italian rabbis that defend him, they say Germany and Poland, and the Wesley says no, it's only Poland. I guess they come from Poland, which is why he's arguing this. So he has this. So they attack Wesley right away, and they're very upset about him. I mean, very strong language. You can look in those drushes and there what they say and their attacks on him, and then that's where we get his response in Volume 2, where he starts the second part is interesting because he starts defending himself and he attacks them. So he's kind of going both ways, not by name. And then in the third, he walks back. In the fourth, he starts walking back and walking back and walking back.
Yes, I think that's the just description of the process of what happened between 1782 and 1785. It's about 3 or 4 years of controversy over Divrei Sholom ve'emet. So first of all, the fact that there were so many reactions that we know about, that Wesley know about, and some texts that we also have today. We don't have all the texts, I think, of the reactions against Wesley of the time. That's actually an evidence that his mission was successful. He wanted to influence the Jewish public opinion. So at the time, what's the meaning of public opinion among the Jews? It was mainly, I believe, the network of the rabbinical elite and the new network of Maskilim that was just emerging at the time. So there were people who read it and people who reacted to it, and there are many arguments against Wesley. You mentioned earlier, rightly, that before 1782 he was a favorite. Few rabbis who later attacked him. So what really happened? And it's also important when we carefully read some of the sermons that were actually delivered against him, mainly in the drashot of Shabbat HaGadol Tav Kuf Mem Bet of 1782, and especially the sermon delivered by Rabbi David Tevli of Lisa, that the rabbis didn't say anything against the emperor. They didn't say, well, we are against the tolerance patent, and they didn't say anything against the idea that children should also know something in the German language or arithmetic or other subjects. This was not the issue. Of course, they were very worried that they didn't want an equal equilibrium between general and Jewish topics. They wanted that the Jewish topics will have the upper hand in the education. But the main thing was their surprise, amazement, and even anxiety that a person like Naftali Herz Wesley dared to speak in public, and that he wanted to change the system, and that he dared actually to speak above the heads of the rabbinical elite, because Tevli, he was the most, let's say, explicit, and in his reaction, he said, Wesley is Hediot Sheba'ediotim, meaning he's a layman. Who gave him the authority to speak in public? Who gave him the authority to write, publish, and send those the pamphlet, Divrei Sholom ve'emet? He is not one of us, and only us, meaning the rabbinical elite, has the privilege and authority to speak to the public and to show them the right way in anything. So it means Vesely in Divrei Sholom ve'emet actually broke the authority of the rabbinical elite. And he put himself in a new position, the position of the secular modern intellectual. And I'm using the term secular very, very carefully, because Vesely, by any criteria, was a kind of an orthodox. He was a believer. He actually defended the Jewish faith. He fulfilled the commandments. He was shomer mitzvot in our terms. He was an orthodox, but he was a secular intellectual as a new social type in Jewish society, an intellectual who is very learned by himself. He doesn't belong to the Talmudic elite. He's not a rabbi, but he is a secular type of intellectual. And this is, according to my interpretation of everything that happened there around Divrei Sholom ve'emet, that this is the core of the revolution. And that's why the subtitle of the book that I just published, Divrei Sholom ve'emet in new edition, is The Revolution of Modern Jewish Education.
And it's well put as well. And there's a couple of things to just comment on and pick up on, as you say, although he was promoting a kind of secular idea. The book, all his works are written in a wonderful, beautiful Hebrew, and they're replete with quotations from Chazal, from Tanakh. I mean, he's quoting, you read this work, besides he's obviously pushing these radical new ideas for the time, but it's extensively quoting all over. You have to, it's a learned work where you're reading Chazal, you're quoting extensively Medrash, and he's quoting Gemaras, and that's what he's doing. That's what he does in all his works. And as you say, he lays out his new educational program, which he elaborates on in the second one, where he goes through first how, they would just learn Gemara all day. And he says, no, you should start off with Mikra. And he talks about, just to quote some quotes, he says, we don't learn anything about Gemara. I understand we learn Mishnah and Talmud. We don't budge. What do you do with, where it says you have to learn Mikra? And he goes on extensively and he talks about later on, you have to read it. There's a lot. It's a wonderful read, by the way. And he talks about a lot of, out of that. And then he lays out the educational program. Start off with learning Mikra, start off with basic diktuk, understand the words. After that, the kids should move on. They should learn, you should translate it into the language, German or wherever he's writing, to Italy, Italian, wherever the language is, the vernacular. Then they should move on past that. They should go, and they should at the time learn basic ideas klalius, if you will, basic concepts. And then they should learn a little bit secular, some history, geography, math, and so on. And he also continues on that they should go to, and then eventually, like you said, and they should also learn like almost a catechism. They should learn basic emunah, basic ethics. And then once that, then they'll see if it's proper for them to move on to Mishnayos, Gemara. And he actually lays out also how you should teach Gemara in his opinion. You don't just jump right in. You have to go back and forth, explain to them, and hopefully they should know. And he walks on. And I'll just mention this here as well, which is ironic to some extent to me reading this. And obviously we don't follow his program completely. But today, I can speak, because I'm speaking from Lakewood, we essentially follow this educational program. That's how the kids start off learning. You start them off with basic words and nekudas and diktuk, and then you go and you teach them chumash, and you translate it into the vernacular. Most yeshivas, some translate to Yiddish, but most translate it to English or whatever it is. You translate into the vernacular. Then they move on eventually to Rashi. Then they move on to Mishnayos. Then they move on to Gemara, and we obviously have secular education. So to some degree, so they essentially are doing this. Obviously, not everything is the same. Times are very different, and this was a controversy at the time. But it's so interesting to see that. also, he defends himself extensively. He quotes the Hafal Asan. He's defending himself where that we mentioned that medrash that made the Yehuda so upset. Kol tam l'chacham she'in boi das nevela toiva mimenu from Vayikra, I think it's Vayikra, Medrash Rabbah. He quotes the Shmuel Yaf Ashkenazi, the Fein Mara. He says, well, he says this and others say this. You can't only blame me. Did you look at the classical Mefarshim? Obviously he was using it in a different way. He was using it for a different purpose, which is why. And throughout the second letter, it's quite interesting to read how he defends himself, and then he attacks them, and he defends himself, and he attacks them, and then he walks it back. So it's kind of interesting to see all of that coming from his mouth.
Yeah, it's important, of course, to mention that the other three parts are mainly apologetic. He was he was insulted. He was insulted by the criticism, by all those drashot, and he said, well, I'm not what you are describing. I'm not a layman. I'm not an epicurus. And everything that I'm saying is you can find in the sources, and you can find in historical in previous historical times when this was the way that Jews behave, and you can look now around, especially to the Sephardic and Portuguese communities in Amsterdam and other places, and see that this is exactly what they are doing. And then he went and asked Italian rabbis to support him, and he got mainly letters of support that he published in En Mishpat, and he said, well, see, you can see now that in Italy they don't see any problem in what I'm suggesting now. It's not really a revolution. It's more, let's say, going back to the proper way, a seder anachon in Jewish education. But at the bottom line, as you have just said, and I believe that this is the same among, let's say, modern Orthodoxy also in Israel, and even in the secular education in Israel and other places, that's the way that most Jewish children study in school. From that point of view, Divrei Sholom ve'emet was a great success. This is a basic classical text that actually laid the foundations for modern Jewish education. That's what we are doing today. And that's why I believe that it's still relevant and important today. And just imagine, this is a book from the 18th century. This is the plan from the 18th century. And we are following it today. In many respects, and I really believe that this is the right time to read it again. By the way, as you just mentioned, except of the first part of Divrei Sholom ve'emet, all the other parts, if you want really to read it deeply and to understand, you need to have some rabbinical education. I think the Talmid Chacham should read it. Otherwise, it's really, it doesn't mean a lot, especially the long footnotes that he added to the other three parts of Divrei Sholom ve'emet. But if you want me to say something about why this is the right time and why it's still important to read Divrei Sholom ve'emet, I think that we all know that we live in difficult times to the Jewish people everywhere, and in Israel in particular. And we really understand that what we are experiencing right now is not just the results of what happened a year or 2 years ago, but the origins are back in previous generations. And the 18th century could give you many examples of unsolved problems that we are still engaging with in the 21st century. And Jewish education was and still is, I think, the main indication if we want to understand the different opinions among the Jewish people, if we want to understand the Jewish culture war that started in the 18th century, and believe that controversy around Divrei Sholom ve'emet was the first actually campaign in this ongoing culture war. And we can see, reading Vesely and understanding the context and understanding the person, how an open and critical view can live without any contradiction with believing, with fulfilling the commandments that, and again today we sadly believe that it's something impossible, especially in Israel, especially among the ultra-Orthodox, among the Choredim in Israel, that you should take a side, that if you are seculars, that then you only study secular subject, you know nothing about Judaism, and if you are a devoted Jew, then your world should be only in Jewish topics, in Torah, in Talmud, in Halacha, and nothing else. And here, the Maskilim of the 18th century, not just Vesely, also Moses Mendelssohn, can give you a good example how the worlds can be combined, and even more of them, more of that, not just that a foreign world combined with our own internal world, that this is actually one world. This is one culture. And all we need to do is to understand deeply the origins of Judaism before the two main camps of Orthodox and all the others emerge in the modern times.
Okay, so it's a smaller format, but it's 350 pages, so there's a lot to read in here. And as you said, I mentioned earlier, some of the quotations, I mean, really it is very rabbinic, especially the latter three parts. Really is, you have to really but you have to have a background, really, to understand what's going on or what he's saying. But he writes in a wonderful Hebrew. It's really enjoyable to read. And you can, again, you have your introduction in your book, The Jewish Enlightenment, which I'll link to. You talk extensively about the controversy. Just a couple of things to point out about him before we end. Obviously, we could do much more on him, on Wesley, but there was in the Kivitz Beis Aaron Yisrael, a Stalin journal, published a bunch of back and forth and manuscript works about the controversy. They have one of them is all the rabbis who quote Wesley and use his works after the controversy. And what's interesting also to point out is they started off writing his name and they wrote Yud Mem Shin, Yamach Shemai, they wrote on him. But towards the end, it was like a series of articles. They stopped with that. And I was told that someone said that when he spoke to the guy, went through, and he said he realized he can't write that. And again, you just Archon Haskama, other Haskamas that he got, and those that quote him extensively later on. It was a complicated figure in a complicated time. And so, again, his works have been redone. So I will link to the Divrei Sholom Emes. We'll say your new edition, which you have the introduction, you have some notes and sources. This new introduction, it's Mossad Bialik. It's in their Dorot series in the paperback, so it's like $20 or so, not expensive. But for those interested in America that may not know, Mossad Bialik does ship. You can order directly from them. They ship with DHL. It comes out in 3 days. So I think it came out when I ordered this right away about $43 or so. So again, it's a little bit more pricey than a paperback would be, but it's not like crazy expensive, and you can order it here. For those interested just in the old print, which is an old print, the scan, there is available on Amazon, a print on demand for $6.99. You get the old print, but this one is much nicer than the old one. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. One thing I do want to go ahead.
Let me finish with focusing on the title, Divrei Sholom ve'emet, something that we actually today so badly need. Shalom, we need peace. While we are experiencing war, we need truth while we are experiencing a new kind of post-truth and alternative facts way of referring to the world. So shalom ve'emet, we so badly need them today.
Okay. Yes. Amen. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Feiner, for joining me once again.
תודה רבה, תודה רבה. גמר חתימה